Thomas knelt at the lamp, fingers working the brass hook, and felt leather catch on wet gutter. He pulled free a small child's shoe, half buried in oil, dark water. Suspicion tightened his chest as he set the shoe beside his lamp. The wick would not hold, and the flame guttered each time he coaxed it. He breathed smoke and oil, and that breath had a shape. Something had been wrong in the street tonight. He rose with the shoe in one gloved hand and a lamp shedding thin light in the other, aware that a missing child and extinguished lamps were not separate troubles, but a single problem moving through the city's dark. He checked the lamp again, shoving the brass hook through the soot and drawing the wick up. The flame took in a short, blunt flare and died. He tapped the glass and rubbed the brass. No steady light. He listened at the corner. Footsteps on cobble, the whisper of a shawl, a worker's cough, small, ordinary sounds that did not explain a child's shoe in a gutter. Thomas straightened and started down the lane, the shoe heavy in his pocket, the suspicion pulling at him like a stitch undone. He had been a lamplighter for 20 years. He knew the pattern of lamps and the soft logic of alleys. Which lamps failed from damp wicks, which failed when the oil ran low. He knew, too, where women left coins and where children left toys. The street taught him to separate accidents from intention. Tonight the pattern felt intentional. He crossed a threshold of shadow toward the factory lane and found wet footprints where the mud had a different texture, faint, smaller, and cut across the larger prints from boots. He paused at the lane mouth and called, "Hello." The voice left his mouth small and reasonable. He did not yet know whether to call for help. A figure came out under a gas lamp. Maggie, shawl wrapped tight, apron dark at the hem. She kept walking until Thomas stepped forward and set his lamp between them. "Thomas," she said, stopping. "The lamps, something's wrong down on Hogshed Lane. 2 are out and the others smell like someone smudged them with oil. I found a child's shoe at Church Row," Thomas answered, showing the leather. "That lamp won't stay lit." Maggie bent to study the shoe without taking it. She ran a thumb along the sole and squinted at the stitch, that stitch. "My sister did hymns like that. Eleanor's got a girl who wears shoes like these." Her voice carried a tiredness Thomas knew from factory nights. The syllables short and precise, the muscles behind them compacted by long hours. Suspicion shifted in him toward worry. Worry made him check the lane further. He led the way, Maggie close, their lamps blotting small circles of yellow in the mist. They found the lane marked. At the second lamp the glass was smeared with a dark ring and a thumb, wide streak toward the base where oil had been rubbed across the metal. Thomas tapped his gloved knuckles along the smear. "Deliberate," he said. Maggie's mouth tightened. Someone doesn't want light following them. They moved on, the lane narrowing, factory walls pressing in. Steam rose from drain mouths. Maggie pointed at the cobbles. A ragged thread of wet prints veered left, and then stopped by an iron gate. It cuts toward the courtyard. Eleanor's house sits off the yard. Her girl was late for supper. At the lodging house doorway Alina stood with the kettle in hand, shawl thrown back from her shoulders. She had her keys looped heavy on one finger, and the light from inside the boarding house warmed the threshold like a small, careful hearth. Eleanor's face folded with a kind of arithmetic. The plate in her hand, the spot of steam, the untended palette in the back. She did not reach for labels. She set the kettle down and pointed to the hearth. "The child's plate has been scraped, and the palette is unmade." She didn't sleep. She left her supper half-eaten. "Thomas, Maggie, there's no child here." Eleanor's voice was a practical thing that held an alarm. Her hands moved to fold the cloth precisely as if a tidy cloth could hold things steady. Maggie's jaw worked. "Who last saw her?" she asked. Eleanor named another tenant, and the two women argued in quick lines of trade. Where children tend to go late, whether the river was safe, who might have last taken the East Road. Their speech fit the city's measured dealings. Each name they spoke carried weight. Thomas stepped back, the lamp raising a pool of shadow at his feet. His suspicion slid toward a sharper fear. He had to make a choice. Wait for more people or follow the trail. He chose to follow. "Show me where the prints go," he told them. They moved as a small party into an alley behind the tenements. The cobbles sloped and the lane narrowed. Thomas found a scrap of shawl snagged on a nail, threads ragged and the color gone from too many washings. Maggie crouched and touched the stitch, then straightened. "It's Elena's work," she said. Her fingers smelled of coal and starch. She held the scrap to the light, and Thomas watched her face change from tiredness to an expression that bared the urgency under her ordinary steps. They reached a locked iron courtyard gate. Thomas ran his lamp hook along the iron bars to peer through. In the courtyard, stacked crates formed a narrow passage between the warehouse wall and the stairs. He saw movement. Not a face, not a defined shape, but a thin, human-sized outline that slipped between the crates. It moved with a quickness that made Thomas' breath shorten. He pressed his ear to the metal and heard cloth scrape. "Someone's hiding there," he said. Maggie's hand found the handle of her coin purse. Eleanor put a palm flat to the doorway and waited. Thomas tried the gate. It held. He looked at Maggie, he looked at Eleanor. They exchanged decisions without words. Eleanor would not ask them to break a neighbor's gate, and Maggie would not stand while a child might be in danger. Thomas took a breath and set his shoulder against the iron. He shifted his lamp to the crook of his arm and hived. The gate gave with a groan and they slipped inside. They moved carefully, lamps held low, so they did not spill light into every corner. A rat scurried from a crate. A tin can clattered and broke the silence. Eleanor put out a hand to stop Thomas and pointed to a smear of oil on the boards leading toward the river. The oil smears were not random. They formed a line that led past stacked barrels and toward the low bridge where the river breathed cold and persistent. At the riverbank the city smelled of wet rope, coal and engine oil. The lamps around the quay cast cones of light that faded into breathy gray. Thomas held his lamp higher. He saw a small figure at the waterline. The figure stood pale against the wet stones. It blinked. When Thomas stepped forward, the figure blurred, not by distance but by the way its edges slid and thinned, like a photograph rubbed clean at the margins. "Thomas, Maggie." Voice barely more than a breath. "Do you see that?" He did. Thomas' fingers tightened on the lamp hook. The fear that had tightened in his chest now moved his limbs. He took a step nearer and the figure turned its head slowly. It had a face that held no expression, but it looked like the child who had been missing from the lodging house. The child took one small step and then seemed to dissolve into a low mist that rose from the water. Thomas lunged. His lamp struck the wet stone. The glass cracked. Hot oil splashed and a strip of flame flared, then snapped and fell out. Thomas's hand slipped. He reached and felt nothing but cold air and damp rope. Maggie cried out and Elena moved forward, the kettle clanging against her ribs. Their hands groped at the fog and at shadow and the place where the child had been. The lamp lay broken at Thomas's boot, its brass bent. They stood with rain, slick cobble underfoot, and the river making a steady sound. The three of them breathed in the same small, shocked rhythm. Thomas picked up the broken lamp, feeling the jagged metal under his glove. He set the shoe from his pocket on a wet stone and looked across the water. There were no footprints leading into it, only the faint smear of oil that had ended at the edge. "Maggie, we can't leave it like this. Eleanor, someone must watch the house. Thomas, you go on your rounds. I'll go in and tell the others at the factory." Eleanor folded her shawl and reached for her keys. Her voice was steady though her hands were not. "No, you both stay. I'll lock the doors and fetch more lamps. If that child returns, I want us all awake." They argued 3 quick lines. Thomas insisting he know the ropes and could find patterns among lamps. Maggie wanting to roust neighbors and bring help. Eleanor insisting watch and shelter first. The exchange sharpened the choices. In the end, Eleanor took the door and set it to, and Thomas and Maggie divided the courtyard to check lantern posts and drains. They found the kitchen plate half cleared, a child's chair pushed away from the hearth, a bowl with a spoon left standing. Eleanor hummed a soft tune as she wiped the bowl, the sound practical and small, not a comfort but a preparation. She folded the child's apron and placed it on a hook. Everything was ordinary except for the absence. The ordinary things made the absence louder. Thomas walked the streets with a heavier step. He tested several lamps and found smears at each base, a deliberate pattern of dark rubbed oil that pointed toward the river. He noted where oil was thicker and where it stopped. His suspicion moved into method. He recorded details by touch and sound. The sticky smear on one lamp that matched the smear on another, the way a boot scraped slightly different on a step. These were facts he could act upon. At one lamp, a neighbor called from a window and asked what had happened. Thomas explained with short sentences, a shoe, a broken lamp, smears toward the river. He spoke like a craftsman listing faults. The neighbor pressed her face to the glass and called a name. Then another tenant below answered that nobody had seen the child come home. The exchange added names and thin realities to the night's pattern. Two events changed the day. First, a very small thing. A scrap of ribbon pinned to a drain pipe that had not been there earlier. Maggie recognized the ribbon's faded blue and said, "That was stitched into my niece's hem last spring." The ribbon moved the suspicion into a certain worry. Perhaps someone had been gathering small items as they moved through the dark. Second, a larger thing. Thomas found a smudge of soot on a warehouse shutter that matched the smear on the lamp bases, but also had a slight thumbprint pressed into it. The print was not clear enough to name a hand, but it was fresh enough to make them hurry. They returned to Eleanor's door before dawn. The sky had a brittle edge. The lamps burned low and the city drew breath for the coming day. Eleanor fastened the latch and placed the kettle on the hearth. Her actions had a deliberate rhythm. Fill the kettle, light the stove, set a plate. She moved as if each small domestic motion could alter the night's facts. Thomas set his repaired lamp on the sill and looked out over the street. Maggie smoothed her apron and set the small tin pail by the door. Inside the lodging house, voices came in short lines. Did you see the prints? Where did she go? Could someone have taken her toward the river? They argued not to the point of blame, but to the point of decisions. Eleanor made two choices. She would stay at the house to watch the vestibule and keep the kettle warm. She ordered a neighbor to lend an extra lamp to set at the stair. Maggie would go back to the factory and tell two older women to watch the alley at shift change. Thomas would make the rounds again at first light, checking each lamp and the oil pattern for repetition. When dawn laid thin color over the rooftops, they opened the door. The shoe waited on the step, damp but whole. There was no child waiting inside. Eleanor locked the gate and put the kettle back on, and a neighbor passed through carrying a ladder to prop a lamp higher. People did small things, a ladder set against a lamp post, a rope tied, a pallet smoothed. These acts were not resolution, but they were instruments against helplessness. The river belonged to the city. It kept what it collected and showed little mercy. Thomas walked the quay again at sunrise, feeling a new scruple in his steps. He listed to himself where light fell thinnest and where smells pooled after night. He noted that the smears stopped near the bridge, and that the air there held a different dampness. He called to Maggie at the factory gate and told her what he had seen. She folded her hands into her shawl and said, "I'll have Mrs. Pike keep watch tonight. Tell me what else you find." They had two shifts of emotion across the night. It began with suspicion, moved to urgent worry, then to a sharp fear at the river's edge, and after the broken lamp, a slow settling into practical vigilance. Their feelings shaped their actions. Thomas's suspicion turned to evidence-seeking. Maggie's worry turned to message, bearing at the factory. Eleanor's alarm turned to protection for her tenants. Their choices were small but decisive. Break a gate, clean a plate, Keep a lamp burning. There was a surprise that changed how they understood earlier signs. When Thomas rinsed the child's shoe by the hearth, he found under the sole a faint imprint of tar from a barge's decking and a smudge of sewing floss tied in a particular knot. The knot matched the way the child's mother tied her apron strings, a personal mannerism that linked the shoe unambiguously to the lodging house. The imprint of tar told a more specific story. Someone had carried the child or the shoe near a barge. The detail shifted the search. It turned a night of general danger into a night with a direction. They spent dawn making decisions. Eleanor promised to keep the door bolted until the landlady in the next street could come and help. Maggie arranged for 2 women from the factory to stay after shift and patrol in pairs. Thomas planned to change his route to circle the quay every 30 minutes rather than the usual hour. They did not yet know whether the child had been frightened away, followed someone, or been taken by a stranger. They only knew that the city had been rearranged by a few deliberate smears and one vanished outline at the water's edge. By the time the sun pushed higher, the lodging house settled into a wary routine. The kettle sang. The pallet remained unmade. Eleanor sat on a stool and mended a tear on a patch of cloth she held up under the light. She hummed the same tune and every so often looked up to the door. Her hands moved with the steady attention of someone who kept small things safe so larger ones might be found. Maggie returned to her work at the factory, but kept looking toward the gate whenever a cart passed, expecting to see a child's face among the crowd. Thomas resumed his rounds with a new habit of checking the bases of lamps for fingerprints and oil smears, and he recorded the positions in the small leather notebook he carried in his satchel. He found that when he described facts aloud, smear at the second lamp, thumbprint to the west, neighbors listened and offered small aids. A borrowed lantern, a note pinned to a door. The city's response was composed of everyday acts rather than dramatic rescues. That evening they gathered at the doorway again. The shoe was still by the sill. Eleanor refused to let it out of sight. She pinned the shoe to the mantel with a length of thread and folded the child's apron over it. They set an extra lamp on the stair. Maggie put the patched shawl over the chair. Thomas stood by the threshold and tested the wind by the sound it made through the chimney. The city kept turning, but the lodging house held a small, deliberate watch. They spoke in short sentences, making plans and recording small observations. If she were carried, it would be toward the barges. Thomas, if she left of her own will. She'd head to the market, Maggie answered. Either way, we keep the house lit. Eleanor finished and lifted the kettle. As the night settled again, Thomas found himself pausing at every lamp, listening for the scrape of small feet, a low voice, anything that linked the shoe to a person. He had moved from suspicion to action, from fear to a cautious steadiness. And the transition was visible in the way he handled his hook and in how he checked for prints. The city's ordinary devices, lamps, kettles, locks, became tools and clues in the slow work of watching and waiting. When the first light of morning arrived, it found 3 people who had chosen different forms of care. Eleanor had closed the kitchen and set a second plate by the hearth. Maggie left for the factory with an arrangement for women to meet and watch the lanes. Thomas walked the river one last time, leaving the lodging house with a lamp tied in a cloth and a new notch in his memory. A child's shoe, a smear of tar, a broken lamp, and a promise made in hurried voices. They had not solved the disappearance. They had not found the child. But they had turned their fear into action in ways the city could hold until the next watch began. Eleanor tightened her shawl and shut the front door. She set the kettle back on the hearth, drew the curtains a little closer, and straightened the child's small chair. The house settled into a quiet that was not relief, but a practical readiness. Outside, the street lights dimmed by order, but the lodging house kept its bright corner of lamplight on the cobbles, a small compass for anyone who might find their way home. The factory gate slammed and a woman's voice cut the yard. "My little Joan, where is she?" Maggie pushed through the press of bodies and the foreman's iron hand on the latch. Thomas, 2 lanes away, was bent at a lamp, his gloved thumb trying the wick while his chest tightened with suspicion at how often the flame died that week. A man at the gate called, "Someone's taken a child," and the courtyard tasted of oil and late sweat. The missing child became a visible danger the moment Maggie grabbed the gatepost and looked back toward the lane where Thomas kept muttering to himself over a lamp that would not burn long. Maggie moved with the hurried rhythm of someone who had timed a day by the factory whistle for years. She walked fast, shoulders hunched against the damp, clutching her tin pail. At the gate she barked a short question at the foreman. "Who saw her last?" she asked. The foreman pointed downriver, toward the market stalls, and mouthed a direction. Maggie did not wait for permission. She ran. Thomas stayed with the lamp for one more crooked breath. His suspicion pushed him along the cobbles. A lamp failing near a doorway suggested tampering, not accident. He set the lamp into its bracket with care, tested the wick, and then made the choice that had become a habit when small things did not add up. He left his supply chest unlocked and followed the faint trail of oily footprints toward the market lane. They met at the narrow alley where crates leaned and a cart lay on its side. Maggie coughed once and pointed. "There," she said, "that basket's been tipped." Thomas stooped and picked up a small, damp slipper half buried in grime. He held it by the toe and said, "This is Joan's size." Maggie kissed the back of her hand and rubbed the heel with her thumb. No one had time to say more before a vendor shouted and a dog barked. Life forced them on. They moved quickly, scanning the stalls. Maggie checked under a cloth for a lost handkerchief. Thomas turned a crate and found a smear of dark grease on its underside. He touched the grease with the tip of a finger and smelled it, sharp, rancid oil that did not smell like his lamp oil. Suspicion hardened into a new shape. Someone had come through the lanes after the lamplighter, leaving darkness in their wake. Maggie's voice shortened into single lines. "Who would do that?" she asked. She the name of the missing child again and again, as if repeating a rote could bring the child back. "Joan," she kept saying. Thomas answered with a list of small things he had noticed. Cut wicks, a brass tool left careless, a smear of oil not from his chest. He the name Eleanor, and Maggie's mouth tightened. "Eleanor," she repeated. "She'll know what to do." They ran to Eleanor's lodging house without waiting for the watch. The door hit Thomas's hand as they pushed inside. Eleanor was at her hearth with a kettle on the boil. She looked up, folded her hands and said, "What now?" Her tone held a steady edge that left no room for theatrics. Maggie handed her the slipper and told her everything in short bursts. "A child's gone. The lamps keep failing. The wick won't hold. We found this." Eleanor's face did not change, but her fingers tightened around the slipper. She put the kettle down, folded the handkerchief into her palm, and moved toward the stairwell. "Go check the rooms," she told Maggie. "I'll see if anyone's left the back steps open." Her choice was immediate. Protect the house first, then chase the alley. Her action turned private fear into a duty shared among the 3. They climbed the communal stairs together. The stairwell smelled of boiled potatoes and damp wool. On the second landing, Thomas stopped and pointed at the railing. A thin strip of iron was blackened and pitted, as if someone had pressed a hot thing along it. Eleanor ran her thumb along a torn edge of a blanket snagged on a step. "That's been ripped," she said. "Look here." The 2 clues sat close enough to be read together. Burn marks and a torn blanket. Maggie swallowed and tightened her shawl. Outside, the lane was a string of small noises. A kettle clanking, distant footsteps, a child coughing. The 3 of them followed a faint smear of oil that led toward the blocked cellar door under a shuttered shop. Thomas crouched and traced the smear with a finger, then brought the finger to his nostrils. The grease smelled wrong again. Someone's been using this to kill the wick. His voice had the flatness of a man relaying a fact, but his hands trembled a little. They pushed the cellar door. It resisted for a moment, and then gave with a sound like old wood surrendering. Inside, the air was colder and smelled of paper and wet straw. They found a narrow alcove where a tarpaulin had been arranged as a screen. Behind it, faint rustling. Eleanor called, "Who's there?" and the voice that answered was small and sudden. "Please, please, miss." They pulled the tarpaulin aside and revealed a gaunt man with a child pressed to his chest. He clutched a small phial of lamp oil. The child squinted at the light and whimpered. The man's eyes darted from face to face. Thomas stepped forward with the lamp and felt his body brace for a fight. Maggie's hands folded over the child and held on as if counting the beats of the child's breathing. The confrontation was noisy in short bursts. "What did you do?" Thomas. His voice was low and even, but his hands moved to the lamp hook. The scavenger answered quickly. "I didn't mean to hurt no one. I needed a light for my boy." The scavenger's words came fast and ragged. "Eleanor, you took oil," her tone cut to the practical. "Theft or survival?" The man's shoulders shook. "I took from the barrels by the east quay. I swear." Thomas and Maggie both stepped closer. "Give him here." Maggie to the scavenger, mouth tight. She held out her hands for the child. The scavenger hesitated and then passed the small body forward like a lithe, tired thing. Maggie touched the child's cheek for warmth. "John," she said softly. The child blinked and did not answer at first. Words moved fast between them. "Why the cut wicks?" "Thomas," Maggie demanded, "why cut the wicks and leave our lamps to die?" The scavenger's eyes fell to the phial in his palm. "They sold the oil cheap," he said. "People buy what I can get. I thought—" He stopped and swallowed. "Eleanor, you thought darkness would let you work unseen." Her voice did not rise. The scavenger's jaw worked. He kept reading the room for a hard line he could cross. Eleanor folded her hands and made a decision with her shoulders squared. "We can fetch the watch," she said. Maggie's face tightened toward anger. "If they put a mark on you, will you be safe?" "Thomas." The scavenger looked from one to the other and then to the child. "I'll run," he said. "I'll run and take him and be gone." His voice broke. The child flinched. 3 quick exchanges came then, short and full. "You can't keep children." Eleanor's voice was plain. "He's not a thief," the scavenger said. "He's my boy." "Eleanor, Maggie, we cannot ignore this." "Thomas," Eleanor replied, "we must think for the rest." They spoke in names and in lists. The argument was not loud, but it pivoted hard between blame and need. Thomas unclipped his lamp and held it higher. The light skinned the scavenger's face. He had a ragged pocket and a face that had found more hunger than sleep. Thomas's suspicion shifted toward a different feeling. The tightness eased into something like caution mixed with pity. He did not drop his guard. He did, however, lower his voice. "Tell us how long you've been taking oil," he said. The scavenger measured his answer. 3 weeks, he said. "When the work stops, my boy cries." Eleanor moved to the child and checked for marks. She unwrapped a small corner of cloth and found a scraped knee. "No bones broken," she said. "He's cold and hungry." Her hands were steady. She uncorked the kettle and poured a little hot water into a cup and wrapped the child's hands around it. The act changed the tone from accusation to care. Maggie sat on the step and fed the child the bread she had in her pail. They debated the watch. Maggie wanted the watch fetched. Thomas considered whether the scavenger would run or stay. Eleanor looked at both of them and made a choice that revealed her lean toward practical mercy. "We can keep him here tonight," she said. "We will not hide him. We will put a chair at the door and keep watch." Maggie looked at Eleanor and then at Thomas. "If he tries to steal again," Maggie, voice brittle, "we'll tell the watch." Thomas nodded once. The scavenger lowered his head and began to talk in a low rush. "I pick rags, I sell what I can. At night the barrels are left open and I take a little to burn a lamp so my boy is not cold." He tapped the phial against his knee. "I didn't think anyone would cut wicks. I thought I could sneak by." Maggie watched him and measured each motion with a judgment that could swing to soft or sharp in a breath. "You didn't think," she said. "You thought you'd survive." The line landed hard. A new discovery broke the movement. Thomas found a small brass tool underneath the tarpaulin. He held it up. It had a nick that matched the pattern on several burned lamp wicks they had found that night. "This tool was used to cut wicks," he said. "It came from somewhere else." He looked at the scavenger. The scavenger blinked. "I found it in the gutter," he said. "I thought it belonged to the tradesman." Eleanor folded the cloth around the child and set the kettle back on the stove. She made 3 quick decisions in a row. She put the scavenger at the threshold with a blanket and a bowl. She set a chair with a candle and told Thomas to sleep by the door if he could. She Maggie to wake her if anyone stirred. The set of orders drew a line. They were not forgiveness, but they were shelter with conditions. They sat in tight rows around the little kitchen table and the conversation tightened again. What if they come back and cut the rest? Maggie. What if someone is making profit off the dark? Thomas set the lamp on the table and tapped its brass. "Someone benefits when lamps go out," he said. "They can move goods unseen. They can take children from dark corners." Eleanor put a finger to her lips and said, "We do what we can tonight. Then we decide tomorrow." The group fell into a brittle silence. Outside, a cart creaked on cobbles. A child in the next room coughed. Every small sound became a test. Thomas tightened his gloves and unhooked the lamp again to check the wick. He spoke in short sentences now. "Tomorrow I will change my rounds." Maggie heard the plan and added, "I will keep Joan in sight while I can." Eleanor folded her hands and hummed a line she used to steady the house. They did not rest fully. Every 30 minutes Eleanor roused and listened at the stair. Every hour Thomas walked the landing with the lamp. Maggie sat at the window and watched the lane with a shawl over her knees. These were practical acts. Checking, pacing, listening. They were not speeches of courage. They were small measures against more darkness. At one point late in the night, a footstep sounded outside the lodging house door. The 3 of them froze and held their breath. The sound passed. Maggie's hands shook and she stood to grip the latch. She peered through the peephole and saw only a cart and a man moving on. Her fear shifted into a dry anger. "If they cut the wicks again," she said, "they will meet the watch." Her words had the finality of someone who had decided on an action. The mid-chapter cliffhanger came when Thomas noticed a fresh smear of strange grease on the threshold, identical to the one found in the market. His throat tightened in a way that was not only suspicion now. The smear meant someone had been here recently, possibly watching. He pulled the lamp closer and scanned the dark. Eleanor crossed quickly to the door and peered out. The lane looked empty, but the smear ended at the curb. They exchanged a look that said they were not yet safe. Maggie stood and whispered, "If they wanted this child, why leave him in a place like that?" The scavenger answered in a voice that had not been heard before. "I thought to hide him away until the crowd left. I couldn't feed him out there." The revelation changed the direction of blame. They had to choose whether this man was a danger or a desperate parent. A new piece of evidence arrived with the dawn. Thomas had gone to the lamp chest at the alley and found a scrap of coarse cloth, with an embroidery stitch that matched a patch on a jacket Eleanor had mended the week before. He brought the scrap back and placed it on the table. Eleanor's hand stilled. "This was soon in this neighborhood," she said. "Someone who knows our work." The detail altered the line of suspicion from a random thief to someone who moved among them and used their knowledge. They argued in quick bursts. "We should tell the watch, Maggie. They can trace who buys oil." "If we tell the watch, the scavenger will be hung or made to vanish," Thomas replied. "If we keep him, we risk more theft." Eleanor stopped them. "We will do both," she said. "I will call the watch at first light with what we know. Thomas will examine the lamps along the lane. Maggie will look for Joan's family about the quay." They split the tasks and the tasks steadied them. Thomas left before sunrise with the lamp bobbing at his side. He moved along his route and tested each lamp, noting which had been tampered with. At each post he found small marks and the same strange grace. He wrote the locations on the back of an envelope with a stub of pencil. His suspicion, which had begun as a prick in the chest, moved into a deliberate strategy. Map the damage, look for patterns, watch who benefits. Maggie went to the quay and asked the fishmongers and women at the stalls if they had seen a little Joan. She also asked about oil, who had taken oil away, who had sold it cheap. A stallkeeper named Ruth pointed toward a shed where men gathered after hours. They trade strong light for coin, Ruth. You'll find men who buy what they shouldn't. Maggie's hope shifted into a new plan. Gather who buys and follow them. Eleanor brewed a pot of tea and wrapped the child in a blanket she had kept for guests. She talked quietly with the scavenger while she worked. "Tell me a name," she said. The scavenger whispered a name that made Eleanor's mouth tighten. It was not a stranger's name. It was someone who hung around the covered stalls, someone who had a cart and a face people knew. Eleanor folded the knowledge into a single act. She would call the watch and name the man if needed, but only after she had made sure the child would not be returned to a harsh fate. The dawn came thin and grey, and the lamp in Thomas's hand threw a small circle of warm light onto wet cobbles. He knelt and replaced the wick with one of his own, sealing it with the brass hook and testing the flame until it held. He let it burn for a slow minute and watched it. The action was both practical and symbolic. He would not let the light be taken easily again. His fingers smelled of oil and his knuckles bore a small scrape from the rail he had cleared. Eleanor walked to the door with a sheet of paper and a name written on it. She held it out to Thomas. "This is the man at the shed," she said. "If you find him, bring him back. If not, find the watch." Her voice did not plead, it gave a task. Thomas tucked the paper into his pocket and bowed his head slightly in a gesture that passed for agreement. They resolved the immediate question of the child before the chapter closed. Maggie stayed with Joan until the mother arrived, breathless and scolding in equal parts. The mother grabbed the child and then paused, looking at the strangers who had kept her daughter. She nothing for a long beat, and then pressed the child back into Maggie's arms to kiss the brow once properly. "You took care of her," she said, which was both blame and thanks. Maggie did not answer with a speech. She handed the child back and adjusted her shawl. The scavenger stood at the threshold while the mother held her child. He watched the exchange and then knelt to pick up the feel and the small brass tool. He set them on the stoop and offered them to Eleanor. "Take them," he said. "I have no use." Eleanor took the feel and set it on the mantel. She did not scold him further. She did not call the watch while the mother clutched her child. Instead, she told him to sit and eat. By the time Thomas returned from his rounds, the house smelled of boiled porridge and the kettle had been refilled. He set the lamp back in its bracket and found the three of them around the table, quieter now but still alert. The scrap of cloth with the matching stitch lay folded beside the bowl. The practical choices had been made. A watch would be raised at first light. The watch would be told of names and stalls. The scavenger would be offered a chance to work for Eleanor in exchange for what he had taken. They closed the chapter with a small, concrete promise rather than a speech. "Thomas, I will change my rounds and check the East Quay." Maggie touched his arm and said, "I will watch the stalls." Eleanor folded the paper into her pocket and said, "I will keep a record and speak to the watch." Their voices were short and exact. The day took them into action. The child slept in a borrowed bed. The lamp burned through the morning. The smear of odd grease remained on the threshold as a note. They had not solved everything, but they had decided how they would resist the darkness that had come for them. The chapter ended on a practical beat. Eleanor tightening the kettle's lid, Thomas fastening the lamp hook more firmly than before, and Maggie stepping out to the lane with the slipper in her pocket to ask one last question at the quay. Each action was a small defense against an unstable city. None of them made grand promises. They made plans, watched, and prepared to act again if the lamps failed. Maggie slammed the kitchen door behind her and cried, "My Joan is not at the gate!" Fear tightened her voice so that her words came out clipped and raw. She shoved the shawl from her shoulders, left one muddy shoe on the threshold, and pushed past Eleanor's small table toward the hearth. Eleanor rose with the movement of someone who had practiced sudden action for years and said, "Show me the gate, Maggie. Tell me everything." The problem was concrete. A child missing where a child should have been. Within minutes, Maggie laid out what had happened at the factory gate. The clang of the iron latch, the foreman's hand on the bar, the rush of bodies, and the voice that had called for a Joan. She repeated the same name that had been shouted in the yard an hour earlier. She had heard Thomas at a lamp 2 lanes away, his boots on wet cobbles. And she had remembered the small shoe found beside a gutter when he knelt to work a brass hook. That shoe had been mentioned then. Now the shoe matched her Joan's size. Fear made Maggie's hands quick and tight. She rubbed them together as Eleanor reached automatically for the keys that hung from her belt. Maggie's fear was not only for the child but for the way the city could swallow a small body of someone so easily. She pushed the thought away with work. "Eleanor, lock the back and check the staircases. I'll go to the lane. Take my shawl, take my tea kettle if you must. Call Thomas if he comes." Her sentences were short. They landed like nails. Eleanor moved without argument. The kettle rattled as she set it on the hearth, fingers folding the cloth she always used to dry her hands. Outside, Thomas appeared at the stoop with a wet shoe cupped in one gloved hand and a streak of lamp oil across his palm. He held the shoe out without speaking for a second, as if he were offering an accusation that needed testing. Maggie took it and turned it between her palms. The leather was scuffed. The sole was soft with mud and blackened with oil. Her fingers found a familiar scuff near the toe, and she said, "It's Joan's." Their actions split the room into tasks. Eleanor moved to close the outer door, shutting off the thin leak of cold from the stairwell. Maggie swung a lamp on the table to make certain where each person stood. Thomas set his lamp by the door and kept a hand on the brass hook as if it steadied him. Their conversation was terse and purposeful. "Where did you find it, Thomas?" "Maggie, by the Horse Lane gutter, near the pump." "I knelt," Thomas answered, voice low, "and the shoe lay half, buried in oil." He watched Maggie as she pressed the leather to her cheek, testing the shape. "The wick has been troubled all night. I kept coaxing it and it died back. It felt wrong." Maggie's fear shifted the first time, thinning into suspicion. She looked at Thomas, and then past him to the landing, where the stair to the cellar sat slightly ajar. "Someone moved a crate in your cellar last week," she said. "Did you lock that door tonight, Eleanor?" She Eleanor's name twice, as if each pronunciation could make the question safer. Eleanor answered, hands folded on the kettle. "I lock it every night unless a tenant leaves it open. I was at the stove when you both left. If it is open, someone must have taken a chance." Her voice kept a steady cadence. She folded the keys in her palm like a practiced motion. They agreed without long debate to search the building and then the lane. The plan was small and immediate. Check every door, every stair, every yard. Every delay would make the child colder or farther. The urgency pushed Maggie's legs before her thoughts. She led down the narrow passage toward the back, Thomas close behind with his lamp low. They moved in pairs. Outside on the lane, the air set heavy and damp against coats. Maggie forced her breath into even counts to keep the panic from tightening her chest. They followed a trail. A tiny set of prints in the mud, smudged where they crossed a patch of oil, the oil that told of a lamp, the lamp that told of Thomas' route. The trace narrowed the search from the whole city to one specific alley. The alley was the kind of place a child might slip into without being seen. Stacking barrels, a gutter that swallowed sound, a low cellar door that someone could nudge with their shoulder. Maggie's hands trembled as she touched the door. Her palm felt the cold wood and a remnant of damp. She whispered, "There are prints. Smaller than mine." Thomas crouched to inspect them. "Oil here," he said, tapping the streak with a gloved finger. He used short sentences, each syllable practical. "They lead to the cellar." At the cellar steps, Maggie hesitated, the second shift in emotion, moving from suspicion into a narrower, sharper fear that made her slow and precise. She felt the hollowed sound of the street behind her, the way lamps threw hard circles onto wet stone. Elena held the lantern strap taut in the entrance. The stairway down smelled of old coal and a softness like down pillows left too long in a damp room. The air below the threshold felt colder. It cut across Maggie's face in a single, steady line. Thomas took the lantern and stepped down first, his shoulders bent to the low ceiling. The lamp oil in his hand gave a pool of yellow that showed overturned crates and a child's blanket lodged beneath a barrel. Thomas' movements were careful and exact. He shifted a crate, and the lantern flame missed once, then steadied as he positioned the wick. Maggie's heart hit the floorboards in her chest. "Thomas, there." She swallowed, and the word came out rough. "Listen." A sound came up from deeper in the room. A tiny, suppressed sob, and then a scrape as if someone had tried to smother a breath. That noise tightened every muscle in Maggie. She started down the steps, 2 at a time, and then checked herself, remembering how the cellar curves, how one wrong move will send shadows leaping. Eleanor stayed above, hands gripping the lantern chain, and called, "Maggie, slow." Don't rush the light. Maggie moved with restrained speed and peered around an overturned crate. A small blanket lay bunched, damp on one edge. There was no child at first sight. Then a movement. A thin street boy materialized from a shadowed corner, holding a child to his chest. He looked smaller than any grown man, his face smeared with soot, eyes alert and sharp. The boy set the child down gently. Maggie reached forward with both hands because she needed to know the child was whole. Joan coughed, a ragged sound that pulled Maggie's breath out in a ragged exhale, and then the child's eyelids fluttered. "Joan." "Maggie," and the name steadied her voice. She hit again, calling the child by name as if doing so would anchor the small body back into safety. The street boy stepped back and did not speak. He was not a character they knew. He wore no coat that matched any tenant's. His shoes were thin. He had sheltered the child. He indicated without words, and then he clinched the secret with a look that asked whether they would take him in or push him away. Maggie bent and took the child's hand. The skin was cold and the fingers curled like a fist. She held Joan and felt the body small and stubborn in her arms. "How did you find her?" she asked the street boy. The boy pointed to the lane, then to the puddled gutter. He pantomimed a small figure stepping and then slipping. No words came. His gestures were quick and clear. That silent explanation shifted the group's suspicion into a different channel. Instead of blaming someone in the lodging, they saw an unwatched child who had wandered, and a boy who had done what he could. Eleanor took the child's chin and lifted the eyelids to check color. Her hands worked with the deliberate motions of a woman who had warmed porridge and mended fevered limbs. She set a cup of warm tea against the little mouth, and Maggie held the child's head to allow small sips. The child's cough loosened. The breath came in quieter, wetter pulls. At that moment a heavy set of footsteps passed above, the sound of a man's boots on the yard boards. The noise made everyone still. It was an external event that forced a decision. The timeline compressed. Eleanor hissed, "They'll come down. Hide her." They snuffed the lantern. Darkness gathered, immediate and physical, around their bodies. Maggie pressed the child into the hollow just behind a crate and pulled a blanket over the small shoulders. She felt for the child's shoe and slid it under a crate so it would not show at the lip of the stair. Thomas took one step toward the doorway and then froze. The footsteps on the yard stopped like somebody listening with his boots. A man's voice called from above, "Elinor, you two in there." It was not the foreman, it had the low, rough cadence of a yardman making the rounds. For a breathless beat everyone weighed choices. Reveal a child and risk questions, or keep her hidden and risk accusation of theft if someone searched. Thomas moved into the doorway with a lamp in his hand, not to light the room, but to show himself a silhouette. He spoke with the steady tone of someone used to saying enough to be believed but not enough to be suspected. "Evening," he said. He used his name as anchor. "I am Thomas. I do the lamps in this lane. Everything all right?" The man above answered with a short laugh that suggested both suspicion and dismissiveness. "Just checking the cellar. Nothing for you, lamplighter." "Keep your light tucked," the voice retreated slowly along the yard. Thomas held the doorway until the footsteps moved on. When the silence came back, Maggie exhaled, a single held breath released. The small boy slid from the corner into the light again and took a step forward as though proof were needed. He did not ask for money or praise. He looked toward Joan and then at Maggie with the same directness that someone gives when they have performed an act and expect no reward. Maggie gathered the child and carried Joan up the steps. The movement shifted something in her chest from fear to gratitude, and then to a new worry. How to make sure the child would not slip away again. Eleanor placed a mug of hot broth at the child's lips and fussed at the blanket, while Thomas washed his hands in the basin, rubbing oil from the cuff of his coat. They argued briefly over what to do about the street boy. "Maggie," he found her. "We should feed him and give him dry socks." Eleanor cautioned about trust. Thomas suggested keeping him for the night. The exchange tightened into a rapid, three-line back and forth where each spoke only what the moment required. "Eleanor," he sheltered her. He must have been nearby when the shoe was dropped. Maggie's voice was firm. "But the yard has its share of thieves," Eleanor replied. "Not every child. Finder is a thief, Thomas, and then..." He kept the child warm. That says something. The three voices landed on a plan to feed the boy, hide him in plain sight at the stove, and let the morning decide whether to trust him further. They learned then, in small concrete details, what the boy had done and why. He had seen Joan toddle toward the pump to watch the horses. She had slipped through an unlatched gate. He had followed at a distance, seen her fall near the gutter where the lamp oil pooled, and had carried her to the cellar when a door had been left ajar. Each sentence he made with his hands filled in the immediate facts. The revelation changed their sense of blame. The street was dangerous and careless hands had left a gate unfastened and demanded an action. To protect, to feed, to mend. Eleanor moved with a domestic efficiency that steadied Maggie. She stripped Joan's damp sleeve, folded it, and set the garments to warm on a low iron above the kettle. She produced a small flannel from under the bench, stitched at a corner as if she always kept spare cloth for emergencies. Her hands worked without drama, and that workmanship eased Maggie's jaw. Maggie sat opposite the child and the boy and felt the night's sharpness unspool into tasks. Mend the shoe, dry the blanket, call the child's name to the neighbors, and watch who left the yard in the morning. She the boy where he slept, and he answered by pointing to a doorway under a bridge and making a breathing motion with his chest. The description was spare, not sentimental. Maggie felt a softening that was not sentiment but practicality. They would take measures that would keep the child safe now. As they arranged blankets and tea, Thomas, "The wick in my lamp must be mended. It died twice tonight where the oil caught. I smelled it on the shoe. It may be that someone carried the child where lamps fail. That matters." His voice carried a new suspicion about the rote and about how the shoe had been dirtied with lamp oil. Maggie leaned into that suspicion and asked, "Who else walked that lane this evening? Did anyone stop at your lamps?" She used questions to make people move, to produce facts. Thomas named 3 men who had passed. The yardman, a cart driver, and the foreman who had slammed the factory gate. Eleanor added that a new scrivener had been seen near the northern passage. Each added name and detail. Each answer brought a new angle and a decision to be made. They resolved, at dawn, to speak to the foreman at the factory, to put Joan's shoes in a safer place, and to let the street boy sleep by the hearth under Eleanor's watch. The choice belonged to a group, not to a single woman who had nearly lost her child. Each decision in the low room was practical and small. Mend a shoe, pour hot broth, lock a door. They were not speeches, they were measures. Before morning the boy warmed his feet and slept in a chair that Eleanor arranged beside the stove. Joan, still coughing, slept with her head on Maggie's lap. Maggie watched the child's chest rise and fall and felt a tiredness that had nothing to do with the factory. It was a fatigue made of fear that had traveled to frantic action and then to care. She massaged Joan's small hand and felt the stiffness slowly ease. When light came, Thomas stepped back onto the fogged cobbles with a mended wick tucked in his satchel and a quieter gait than before. The lane smelled of coal and horse. The lamps were still low and Thomas set each with careful practice. Maggie wrapped Joan's shoes in oilcloth and put them in a safe place behind the kettle. They moved through the morning routine with attention sharpened by the night. Eleanor swept the step, humming a short tune while she worked. Maggie read the list of names aloud to see who might have spoken to Joan. Thomas checked each lamphook along his route. Before they parted, Maggie the street boy his name. He shrugged, then said in a clipped voice, "Tommy." It was the first clear word he had offered. "Maggie, Tommy, you must tell me if you see Joan again. Stay by Eleanor's door until the foreman finishes his round. Do not follow the carts." Tommy nodded and accepted a scrap of bread and a pair of patched socks. It was not justice. It was an immediate fix. The boy's eyes were guarded, but something in his posture softened. He moved to the doorway like someone keeping an agreement. The night's events resolved into small claims and small repairs. A shoe mended, a lantern wick replaced, a child's cough soothed. The larger, bitter fact remained. The city let a child slip unnoticed, but each of the three had altered in a practical way. Maggie's fear had driven her into action, then into suspicion, then into relief, then into protective management. Thomas' caution about lamps led to a check of the lane. Eleanor's steady care turned a crisis into a domestic problem and a plan. When the foreman came to ask blunt questions about the child's disappearance, he met answers already prepared. Maggie gave him Joan's blanket and spoke quickly of how the child had been found and by whom. Thomas mentioned the oil on the shoe. Eleanor set a pot of warming broth between them and looked him in the eye while she spoke of locked gates and watchful hands. Their statements were factual and firm. They did not plead, but they did not forgive any carelessness either. The foreman grunted and left with a curt promise to search the yard. He did not apologize. The man's boots receded, and the group let the absence of his presence be a small victory. John remained with them. By daylight the lane seemed quieter, but the consequences of the night settled as practical tasks. Maggie folded Joan's damp clothes. Thomas pinned a small leather patch into the child's shoe, and Eleanor wrote a note to the landlord asking he watch the southern gates. The decisions they made were visible in the morning. Repaired leather, stronger locks, a new arrangement for the street boy to find a place at the kettle when the weather turned. They did not make speeches about fate. Instead they arranged care. Maggie put away the last of Joan's things and said to Eleanor, "Keep a message at the stair. If anyone asks for Joan, bring them to me first. Lock the outer gate at dusk." Eleanor nodded and tied the note to the bunch of keys. Thomas took his lamp and set to his route, his steps measured. He paused at the lane's end and looked back once, as if marking where a small life had almost been lost. Before the day settled, the three had mapped a new pattern of watchfulness. Maggie walked Joan to the pump and held the child's hand while she watched horses pass. Thomas checked each lamphook more carefully than he had before. Eleanor mended seams with an added care. The street boy, Tommy, lingered, his eyes watching the way warm kitchens let out heat and the way hands move when steady. That night, when Maggie set Joan to sleep with an ear for breath, she thought of the shoe that had been found by a lamplighter and of the wick that would not hold. She thought of the choices they had made to hide, to feed, to mend, and how each small move kept life from running away. She slept with a tiredness that had the edge of relief, not the rawness of panic. At dawn, Thomas walked out onto the fog cobbles with his lamp steady and his wrists cleaner for the night's work. Elena folded Joan's tiny shoes into a drawer she had set aside and locked it with a key she placed at her bosom. Maggie walked back toward the factory, the child's hand in hers, and said aloud, "I'll tell the foreman we will watch the gate. If he will not, we will." The sentence was not a vow of destiny. It was a choice about what to do next. Watch, repair, care. The action itself closed the night's tight thread. Joan coughed once and then slept. Maggie tightened her hold on the child's small fingers and opened the gate into the day.